Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I discussed the origins of the War of 1812, its disastrous first year, and how the Madison administration and the war hawks in Congress convinced themselves that conquering Canada would be little more than a matter of marching. I also discussed how Congress refused to fund the Army and the Navy properly, and how the aforementioned invasion of Canada collapsed under the weight of incompetent leadership and terrible logistics. I closed by discussing involvement of Native Americans in the war, how partisan rioting over the war erupted in Baltimore, and how the state and local governments managed to conduct elections during the war, setting a pattern for future instances of elections taking place despite American involvement in military conflicts. In this episode, I'm going to cover the campaigns of 1813 and 1814, the British counteroffensive that culminated in the burning of Washington, D.C., and the financial crisis that almost bankrupted the United States government in 1814, 1815. I'm also going to talk about the political fallout of the war, including the Hartford Convention in New England, and how American negotiators were able to get the better of their British counterparts at the discussions that produced the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war. But before I get into all that, I'd like to once again ask y'all to please like, subscribe, spread the word to any family, friends, colleagues, fellow students that you think might be interested in this thing. It is the best way to ensure that I get to keep doing it. So if you are enjoying it, please like, please subscribe, please spread the word. Thank you for doing any or all of those things. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you are appreciating what I'm putting out there so far. As I do at the beginning of every show, I'm going to give you all a list of the resources that I use to put together this show, and I'm going to give you a question to think about as I go through all of the information. So first things first, the resources are the same as they were for the last episode. It's The American Pageant, a common U.S. history textbook. It is also Give Me Liberty, another very common, usually AP U.S. history textbook. There is, of course, Empire of Liberty, the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers this period 1789 to 1815 by Gordon S. Wood. And then there are a couple newer books that I haven't used for many of the previous episodes. There is The Presidency of James Madison by Robert Allen Rutland, and The War of 1812 by Donald R. Hickey. Those are the resources I used. The question that I think it would be good for y'all to think about as I'm going through this is as follows. How did the war progress and expand through 1813 and 1814? In which ways were the American efforts successful and unsuccessful during those years? And why was the war celebrated as a victory throughout the U.S., though the stipulations of the peace treaty really just restored the status quo before the fighting began? I'll say that one more time. How did the war progress and expand through 1813 and 1814? In which ways were American efforts successful and unsuccessful during those years? And why was the war celebrated as a victory throughout the United States, though the stipulations of the peace treaty really just restored the status quo before the fighting began? So think about that as I'm going through everything. I think it will help you to process all of this information. After the debacle of 1812, and there's really no other way to say it, it was about as bad as it could be with the exception of some of the victories at sea, Madison and Congress finally began to address some of the structural problems that had hobbled the war effort up to this point. Congress approved more troops and authorized construction of new warships. I mentioned that in the previous episode, but progress remained uneven at best. And the war's second year was a mix of failures, some victories, and continued stalemate for the most part. By early 1813, Madison had dumped his ineffectual Secretary of War, William Eustis, and his drunkard, Secretary of the Navy, Paul Hamilton, who got so shit-faced during an official state dinner, or maybe not an official state dinner, but it was an official White House function anyway. He was so drunk, he wasn't even functional in the crowd of people that were there. And he dumped those people in favor of John Armstrong, who would be the Secretary of War, and William Jones, who would be the Secretary of the Navy. So that helped. It cleared out some deadwood and made the Madison administration a little bit more effective. There were more young, promising officers in command of American forces in 1813 as well, including William Henry Harrison out on the frontier in the west, Andrew Jackson more toward the south. Jackson was from Tennessee, at least that's where he hailed from at the time. He was actually born either in North or South Carolina. And Winfield Scott, who I'd mentioned in the previous podcast as an effective officer, and Zebulon Pike, the discoverer of Pike's Peak, in the shadow of which I was born, actually, in Colorado Springs. Anyway, Armstrong began to organize things more effectively immediately. He had divided the nation into 9 districts and assisted in authoring a new code of regulations that would help to make supply, management, and conduct of the armed forces more uniform and more decisive. The overall strategy of the war, though, remained conquest of Canada to push the British into a worse bargaining position, and now those in command saw control of the Great Lakes as key to their successful takeover of Canada. That's not the perception going into 1813. That had not been the perception in 1812. They just thought, again, they could march right into Canada without breaking a sweat and take over the entire place if they felt like it. Not how it worked out, of course. The U.S., in order to accomplish superiority and control on the Great Lakes, had to build up its naval capacity on both Lakes Ontario and Erie, where the British craft outnumbered American vessels 5-1 at the beginning of 1813. So they had some work to do at the beginning of 1813 to accomplish their goal of superiority control of the Great Lakes. And it was really those two that really mattered. Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, they didn't really go all that much into the calculus because the major population centers of Canada are in and around Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, at the time anyway. American commanders put Captain Isaac Chauncey in charge of building up the naval presences in both lakes, and though the British perceived the move and were aware of the threat that it posed, their supply lines were so long and difficult that they could not keep up with what Americans were able to do in building up on Lake Erie in particular. Further east, on Lake Ontario, however, the British maintained naval parity with the United States. In one pretty remarkable incident, a force of about 100 Americans sailed upriver to a British position and stole 2 small gunboats, the Caledonia and the Detroit. Only the Caledonia made it back to the American base, but when the Detroit was severely damaged and left behind, a lot of British supplies were lost that were really important to the British continuing to prosecute the war in that area. One of the most important developments in 1813 came on the western frontier, where William Henry Harrison set out to retake the Michigan Territory and break Native American strength in the region. Harrison built up his forces at Fort Meigs in Ohio. He resisted a British attack there, and then in the fall of 1813, he launched an offensive supported by Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's new fleet on Lake Erie. Perry's victory at the Battle of Lake Erie in September was one of the turning points of the war. In a hard-fought engagement near Put-in Bay with very high casualties on both sides, Perry's squadron defeated the British, captured their ships, and secured American control of the lake. This is control that America would not give up for the remainder of the war. So the United States had control of Lake Erie, which was a pretty big deal. His famous report, Hazard Perry's famous report, quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," unquote, became an instant slogan of national pride, and he was showered with praise and rewards from kind of all over the country. With naval supremacy established, Harrison moved north and defeated British and naval forces at the Battle of Thames in October. The death of Tecumseh in that battle effectively ended serious organized native resistance in the Old Northwest. I've mentioned before that Tecumseh was an important Native American leader. I've read descriptions of Tecumseh as arguably the greatest Native American leader, at least since the founding of the United States. And his death meant that the whole movement to resist American expansion into the Old Northwest, what is now Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, etc., came to an end. In other theaters, however, American efforts remained halting at best. On the Niagara front, U.S. forces won the Battle of Fort George, but logistical disarray and lack of reinforcements forced the United States Army to abandon much of its progress. Raids and counter-raids, including the burning of Buffalo in the United States and the looting of York, which is now Toronto, in Canada, continued across the border on either side throughout the fall. Though there was progress on land, the war at sea took a decided step backward for the United States in 1813. So it's kind of a reversal of what had happened in 1812, where American forces did well on the sea and very poorly on the land. Now the reverse was happening in 1813. The British adjusted to American tactics on the seas and began to patrol in groups, as well as have their merchant ships travel in convoys. American warships were largely bottled up in their harbors because the commanders, both of these ships and of the Navy in a larger sense, didn't want to jeopardize the ships against a newly refocused and determined Royal Navy, which, remember, was the best naval force in the world, hands down, going into this fight in 1812. Additionally, the British began to conduct raids in the Chesapeake in the summer of 1813, and they intensified and extended their blockade, which in 1812 had not been super effective, as I mentioned in the last episode. The raids did damage and struck fear in Virginia and Maryland, where the Chesapeake is situated, and they were largely unchallenged because, again, American naval brass felt that it was not a good idea to send American naval ships out after the Royal Navy at this time. And the blockade, though it excluded New England because New England was, remember, in general pretty hostile to the war, and there were a lot of folks in New England that were actively trading with the British, giving them war supplies and food and other kinds of things that the British Navy and Army needed to keep the fight going. Even though it excluded New England, the blockade really hurt American trade, which fell off a cliff in 1813. And that is very impactful because most of the tax revenue that the American government was expecting to collect at this time came through tariffs. And if there's no trade, or very little of it, there's no or very little tariff revenue. There were 4 significant naval engagements between American and British ships in 1813, and the British got the better of 3 of them, restoring confidence in the Royal Navy and buoying morale in Britain in 1813. Meanwhile, Madison and Congress revived another restrictive trade measure, the Embargo of 1813. You'll remember, if you've watched previous episodes, the Embargo of 1807 and the Non-Intercourse Act and Macon's Bill No. 2 and all these different elements of what were called the restrictive regime. Well, this was the last of them, the last time that this was attempted. And Madison tried to revive this restricted measure, this strategy, in an attempt to hurt Britain economically. The feeling was that still Britain was reliant on American goods, even though that had been pretty well disproven at this point. But Madison and others around him still believed that that was the case for whatever reason. The new embargo of 1813 prohibited virtually all foreign trade and even most coastal trade. But as before, it mostly backfired. Smuggling flourished, and the policy further alienated merchants in New England and New York who were already furious over the war. It just exacerbated existing divisions over the war. This was, I read in all the sources that I did to study for this, to prepare for this show, the most unpopular war in American history, according to historians who covered it, which is kind of strange because this is a war that's a little below the radar, I think, for most of us. It was a long time ago. It didn't last very long. It's certainly not gotten the coverage that, say, Vietnam did, which we think of as pretty divisive because it was. But there was a lot more opposition to this war, actively and passively, than to any war in American history from what the historians that I've read have said. So, the campaigns of 1814, 1813 ends with kind of things being where they had been at the beginning of 1813. Nobody has had any kind of decisive victory, and we go into 1814, but things start to change then. In the summer of 1813, before we get there, an Indian civil war among the Muscogee, or Creek Nation, evolved into a piece of the War of 1812. The Red Sticks faction of the nation, the Muscogee Creek Nation, wanted to follow the likes of Tecumseh and aggressively push back against whites who were usurping their lands. A series of attacks on white settlements by the Red Sticks in May and June of 1813 led to a battle between Mississippi militia and a group of Red Sticks in July. Mississippi is not yet a state, it's a territory, but folks there are organizing, and one of the first things they often do is form a militia, both because they have to worry about Native Americans from their point of view, and because it's just defense is kind of one of the first orders of business for people on the frontier in any part of what is the United States at that time. After the battle with the Mississippi militia, the Red Sticks then attacked Fort Mims, just north of what is now Mobile, in August, and slaughtered 300 of the defenders, many of whom were women and children, as retaliation for the Mississippi militia attack. Volunteers from Georgia and various parts of the Mississippi Territory banded together to fight Red Sticks, and Andrew Jackson, who was a major general in the Tennessee militia at the time, put together a force of 2,500 militia with the aim of wiping out the Red Sticks and then taking control of Spanish Florida, which was still under the control of Spain. Obviously, I'm calling it Spanish Florida. In November and December of 1813, Brigadier General John Floyd inflicted 2 defeats on the Creek villages of Otosi in Georgia and Econochacha, I'm going to say, in Mississippi Territory. It's Econochacha, I think. I'll put the spelling up on the screen for those of you who want to see it. That is in Econochacha, is what I'm calling it, in the Mississippi Territory. Jackson's men also defeated the Red Sticks twice in November, once at their village of Tallahatchie, not Tallahassee, but Tallahatchie, and once at a Creek village called Talladega, where the Red Sticks had been laying siege to a group of their nation, the Muscogee Nation, friendly to whites. Jackson located a base of Red Sticks on the Tallapoosa River, and on March 27th, 1814, his forces routed the Red Sticks at what became known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Nearly 800 Red Sticks died, and their commander surrendered to Jackson shortly thereafter. Even Jackson, from what I've read, who was very bellicose and a disciplinarian, shot deserters himself on several occasions, was a real kind of hard-nosed guy, even by the standards of that time. Even he, looking at the aftermath of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, wrote how it was quite a scene to behold, the destruction and the death that he saw. And if something like that is going to have an impression on Andrew Jackson, you get a sense of just how bad it was. Jackson then forced all of the tribal leaders, even those Creeks who had sided with the United States, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. This treaty meant that Muscogee peoples would cede 36,000 acres of land to the U.S. government, or over half of their ancestral lands in what is now Georgia and Alabama, I believe. Jackson's superiors in Washington were actually really pissed off at him for operating without their say-so, without their authority. But many in the region celebrated Jackson as a hero, and this is not the last time that Jackson would step on the toes of people who were his superiors and get the common folks on his side. It was kind of a staple of Jackson's career, both as a military man and as a politician. By 1814, the situation in Europe had also changed decisively. Napoleon's abdication in April, he was forced to leave after a series of defeats in 1813 and 1814, and he was, at least temporarily, put in exile on the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. So his abdication freed up thousands of seasoned British troops because they no longer had to fight the French. And these seasoned British troops, were then promptly redeployed to North America. What had been an army of less than 20,000 ballooned up to 52,000 by 1814. And again, these are seasoned, veteran, tough-nosed, well-equipped, well-trained, well-disciplined British troops who are coming in to fight the Americans. So that really shifts the dynamics, and the Madison administration, many in Congress, the military leaders on the ground for the United States, all of a sudden got a very serious sense of urgency about wrapping this thing up, because they knew that the odds were shifting and not in their favor. The British High Command planned a series of coordinated offenses as these resources became available in the Chesapeake, along the Canadian border, and in the Gulf Coast. Washington, D.C. was still a very rustic embryo of a city during the war, and in part because of that, as well as the general lack of planning for the war overall, which is a problem that I've described as going on throughout this whole thing, Madison was tardy to take action to protect the capital. When he finally did, in July of 1814, the measures were thrown together and did not have a great deal of urgency behind them. Secretary of War Armstrong, in fact, believed that D.C. had no strategic significance, and that if an attack came to the region, the Chesapeake area, quote, "Baltimore is the place. That city is of so much more consequence," unquote. That's Armstrong. On August 19th and 20th of 1814, though, a British expeditionary force landed in Maryland under Major General Robert Ross and was joined by Rear Admiral George Coburn's Naval Marine forces. The Americans tried to stop them at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th, but the hastily assembled, mostly militia troops, who, remember, are generally not as well trained or as disciplined as regular army troops, panicked and fled the field almost immediately after the shooting started. They ran away so quickly, in fact, that the engagement earned the name the Bladensburg Races because of how the militia fled the battlefield. The road to Washington now was wide open, and panic set in as the government officials and anyone with means gathered what they could and fled the city. This, you may have heard, is when Dolly Madison's famous exodus from the presidential mansion occurs. She was actively putting together official papers. She grabbed a famous painting of George Washington and got that out of there, and she apparently escaped just before the Redcoats arrived. And what they subsequently did reveals why that was a big deal. British troops marched into the capital after their victory at Bladensburg. They burned the presidential mansion, which still was not called the White House yet, and the Capitol building, and other public buildings in retaliation for American attacks on Canadian towns like York / what will be Toronto. Madison and his cabinet barely escaped ahead of the British advance, and the destruction was a profound humiliation. But as Armstrong said, it was not a real big strategic victory because there wasn't a lot of strategic importance to Washington at the time. Certainly not like there is now. It was still pretty rustic, not densely populated, not a whole lot of vital resources there. But even after this humiliating defeat for the United States, British fortunes quickly shifted. When the same forces moved north to attack Baltimore, American defenders were far better prepared for that fight. The British bombarded Fort McHenry through the night of September 13th and 14th, but failed to force its surrender. From a truce ship in the harbor, Francis Scott Key, a name you may be familiar with, watched the bombardment and penned the poem that would become the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner. And it was set to the tune of an English drinking song, if you can believe that, called Anacreon in Heaven. This is a song that these wealthy, elitist, well-educated guys in this club in London used to sing when they would drink together. And that tune eventually provided the tune for the Star-Spangled Banner, believe it or not. The Battle of Baltimore marked the end of the British campaign in the Chesapeake, and it had done a lot of damage, but the United States had managed to survive. Another kind of piece of American lore that I want to mention here that I think is worth shouting out, it's during the War of 1812 that the notion, the idea, the character of Uncle Sam first makes an appearance. And it comes from letters apparently written, and I forget, the letter is to some government official. It's from somebody. I'm forgetting the details now. I may make a short about this just to clarify because I think it's kind of interesting. Everybody knows Uncle Sam. And you start to see from that letter other references pop out. And there are a number of them to Uncle Sam as a substitute for the American government at this time. Although the caricature of Uncle Sam, which is based on Abraham Lincoln, if you look at Uncle Sam, I think you'll see it, doesn't become a thing until much later. But it does at least become an idea during this time period. Elsewhere, outside of the Maryland, Virginia area, fighting continued along the Canadian-United States border in 1814. In July, Americans under Generals Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott invaded across the Niagara River, winning the Battle of Chippewa. But at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, later that month, a brutal, inconclusive engagement that left both sides exhausted and the campaign stalled, the Americans had to retreat again. And this was, from what I've read, the bloodiest battle of the war. Pretty crazy if you read a description of it. It's something I'd recommend Googling if you're interested in how battles are prosecuted. I know there's a lot of you out there that are into that. It's not something I'm as interested in, but that's just me. Anyway, the territory possessed in the Niagara region really had not and would not change much at all by the end of the war from what it had been prior to the fighting. Even after this, the Battle of Lundy's Lane, the bloodiest battle of the entire war, had taken place. Like a lot of the war on the Canadian-American frontier, it was more or less a stalemate. The most ambitious campaign in the North was the planned invasion of northern New York, led by Sir George Prevost. It's spelled Prevost, but I read that it was pronounced Prevost. Anyway, in order to avoid the fate of General John Burgoyne's forces at the Battle of Saratoga, you might remember that was the Battle of Saratoga was the big kind of turning point in the Revolutionary War when the British defeat encouraged the French to sign on an alliance with the United States. So that was something that the British very much did not want to repeat. In order to avoid that circumstance happening again, Prevost planned to march down the western side of Lake Champlain, destroy the American base at Plattsburgh, and then occupy northern New York. His 10,000 men crossed the American border on August 31st of 1814. However, the U.S. had built up a fleet on Lake Champlain over the previous year, and the squadron of 4 warships and about 10 smaller gunboats cleverly arranged itself and waited for the British attack. On September 11th, Commodore Thomas MacDonough won a decisive naval victory during the Battle of Lake Champlain, mostly by battering the British flagship until it was forced to surrender. This defeat at the Battle of Lake Champlain caused the British land forces under Prevost to abandon their invasion of New York and ended serious British hopes of gaining territory in the northeastern portion of the United States. So, Battle of Lake Champlain, pretty important for the course of the War of 1812. As I'd alluded to a bit ago, there was a serious financial crisis that took place in the United States in 1814. The U.S. was very poorly prepared for the war from a financial standpoint. I've talked about this a bunch in the last couple of episodes, and the war nearly bankrupted the federal government in 1814, in no small part because they just didn't raise taxes and there was no Bank of the U.S. Congress had waited far too long, in fact, to raise taxes to a substantial point, as Republicans were loath to approve new duties of any kind. And when taxes were finally enacted in 1813 and 1814, they were woefully inadequate to cover the cost of the war. The elimination of the Bank of the U.S. in 1811 made borrowing chaotic and inefficient, as the Treasury had to rely on a patchwork of state banks and reluctant creditors, not to mention out-and-out hostile potential creditors in the New England and New York area who hated the war and therefore did not want to fund it. Just to put some figures to it, so that you have an idea of what we're talking about here, in January 1814, Treasury Secretary William Jones estimated that the government's income would be only $16 million, while its expenses would be $45.4 million. So it was 200% over the revenues that it needed to just cover its costs in this case. The British blockade was murdering tariff revenue, and many of the northeastern bankers and merchants with the most capital available to lend to the government, again, refused to do so because they opposed the war. By late 1814, the Treasury suspended specie payments, that's gold and silver bullion, on some obligations, essentially admitting it could not pay creditors in gold and silver on schedule. Soldiers often went months without wages. Again, this is something I mentioned before. And procurement contracts for military supplies collapsed under inflation and lack of funding. So soldiers not only were not paid, sometimes for up to as long as a year from what I read, but they were not supplied well, both in terms of food, uniforms, guns, powder, all that kind of stuff. It was a real handicap to the war effort, and one of the many reasons that things didn't go so well for American armed forces. Congress floated the idea of creating a new national bank in 1814 because it got desperate enough to go there, but it never really went anywhere. And ultimately, the only thing that really saved the government from its dire financial position was the British offer to begin negotiating a peace that arrived in Washington in December of 1813, just as the crisis was really picking up steam. And the whole rationale behind that is that the progress toward peace helped mitigate the lack of confidence potential investors were starting to feel in the American government. They felt, these potential investors in American securities felt, that if peace was on the horizon, that regular economic operations could resume pretty soon and revenues to the government would kick back in, and then the government could pay its debts. So it's only really a British offer of peace that kind of saved things. You kind of wonder then, would the British have done that if they'd known how bad the financial position of the United States was, or might they have held off on it to make the U.S. sweat and come to the bargaining table with a worse hand of cards to play? At the same time that this financial crisis is unfolding, New England's deep resentment of the war reached its peak. The British naval blockade had strangled commerce, and the Royal Navy had finally extended it to cover New England ports as well, after leaving them unimpeded for much of the war. Almost all Federalists believed the conflict was an unnecessary Republican folly that had cost the region dearly, and they had no compunction about illegally trading with the British by sea or across the Canadian border when they could, which they did quite a bit of both. This, the extended blockade, and even more severe economic impacts, was the context for the Hartford Convention, which met in December of 1814. Contrary to later myths and political slanders, the Hartford Convention was not a secessionist plot. Some radicals outside of the proceedings called for disunion, called for New England and possibly New York to leave the Union and form their own country effectively. But the delegates themselves, mostly established conservative to moderate Federalist leaders, kept their demands within the bounds of constitutional reform rather than talking much about secession. The convention's final resolutions proposed several constitutional amendments, requiring a 2/3 vote of Congress to declare war or to admit new states to the Union, limiting presidents to a single term. This reflected the fact that the so-called Virginia dynasty of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison had dominated the presidency ever since the new Constitution had been ratified, and prohibiting successive presidents from the same state. Same reason, same rationale. Also, these representatives at the Hartford Convention wanted to abolish the counting of slaves, the 3/5 compromise, for Southern representatives because they felt, I think correctly, that this gave way too much weight to Southern states and that they punched above their weight politically, and it was damaging to all other sections of the country. The Hartford delegates sent envoys to Washington to present their proposals, but the timing could not have been worse. Peace negotiations had already concluded, and news of victory at New Orleans soon overshadowed their grievances. And this is one of the reasons for the demise, ultimately, of the Federalist Party, which I'll get to. Meantime, peace negotiations had been going on since kind of the winter of 1813, 1814, and they really picked up steam in 1814 as the year went along. While fighting raged, American and British negotiators had been meeting in Ghent in what is now Belgium. After the British offering of peace negotiations, Madison rapidly put together a commission to begin discussions. The British initially demanded sweeping concessions: a buffer Indian state in the Northwest, control of the Great Lakes, and territorial adjustments, acquisitions for Britain, really, in Maine. The American commissioners, who included John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, and a couple of others, refused to consider any territorial losses and were generally insulted by the offer, rejecting it out of hand. As British public opinion soured over the cost of the war, and as the British recognized that their military gains in North America were modest and likely temporary, the British position softened greatly. Also, the defeats at Lake Champlain and Fort McHenry in the fall of 1814 helped to reinforce the unpopularity of the war and make it a lot easier for the American negotiators to push something more reasonable. The Treaty of Ghent, which was signed on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1814, essentially restored the, quote, status quo ante bellum, or what things had been before the war began. No territory changed hands, no concessions were made on impressment or maritime rights, which is what the United States have been pushing for this entire time, and the deeper issues that had started the whole war in the first place basically went right back to where they were before the fighting began. So, not a lot was accomplished, but to Americans, simply surviving the conflict without defeat felt like vindication. Even though, as I often like to joke with students, I've done this a lot over the years, they, Americans, started the war with the slogan, "On to Canada," as though they were going to take over the entire country of Canada, like I said, and then finish by cheering, "We didn't lose an inch." It's a lot like starting a diet by saying, "I'm going to lose 50 pounds," and then at the end of it saying, "I didn't gain an ounce." It's like, okay, very different expectations from start to finish, but you do you. You be as happy as you want to be. Okay, last thing I'll discuss, New Orleans and Andrew Jackson. Ironically, the war's most famous battle took place after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed and the war had officially ended. In January 1815, British forces under General Edward Pakenham advanced on New Orleans. General Andrew Jackson, commanding a motley crew of regulars, militia, free black volunteers, Choctaw warriors, and pirates, fortified a position south of the city. On January 8th, the British launched a frontal assault across open ground. Jackson's men poured devastating fire into the British columns, killing Pakenham and inflicting over 2,000 casualties, while the Americans suffered 71. The Battle of New Orleans was a resounding American victory and the most lopsided defeat for either side in the war. It made Jackson a national hero and really launched him into the presidency about 15 years later. When news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived just a few weeks later, the victory at New Orleans merged with the peace settlement in popular memory. For many Americans, it seemed that the war had ended in triumph, despite the treaty that granted the United States none of what it had sought at the beginning of the war, and despite the immense costs in blood and treasure of the war. In the years that followed, the War of 1812 came to be seen as a second war of independence, a validation of American sovereignty and nationhood. This is how Madison and many Republicans had framed it from the beginning, had framed the war, that America was not going to be treated any longer like a third-rate former colony and a place that could be, a country that could be disrespected at will by the great European powers. The Federalist Party, discredited by its opposition to the war and the ill-timed Hartford Convention, collapsed as a national force, even after gaining power in the elections of 1812 and 1814 because of the war's unpopularity in New England and New York. The war also accelerated the rise of new leaders, most notably Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, who, interestingly enough, would become bitter rivals in the 1820s and 30s. And it set the stage for the nationalist spirit that would define the United States in the coming decades. Ultimately, the War of 1812 was an important step forward for the United States as a member of the community of sovereign nations around the world. The U.S. proved that despite its upstart status as a recently independent country and former colony, it could not be treated as lesser than by other world powers. The U.S. absolutely did not achieve what it set out to at the beginning of the war. It certainly did not march into Canada and take it over with minimal effort, nor did it force Britain to end the practice of impressment or the seizing of ships. The end of the Napoleonic War did that. The war demonstrated the importance of military preparedness and of a vigorous and able bureaucracy to carry out American domestic and foreign policy objectives. The notion of vastly shrinking and starving the federal government of funds was dealt a serious blow, and most reasonable potentates and average Americans had to acknowledge that properly financing defense was more important than paranoid fears of a fiscal military state run amok. Further, the war had dramatic implications for the short to medium term political future of the United States. Andrew Jackson became a political superstar, the Federalist Party lost practically all legitimacy, the country became a one-party system for nearly a decade, and a new generation of leaders apart from Jackson, Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, among others, began to take the reins from the first generation, Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, so forth. The conflict had profound impacts on the American economy as well. Nascent American manufacturing became even stronger after the country had been cut off from British manufacturers for much of the previous decade. The market economy began to take shape as internal commerce developed in the absence of international market access, both because of the seizing of ships and then the war and all that stuff itself. And with the growth of the federal government came the emergence of an emphasis on federally funded infrastructure that would link the states together and make all this commerce among the various parts of the United States much more frictionless. Perhaps the single most important consequence of the war was the tremendous boost to American nationalism. One of the country's biggest challenges had been engendering a sense that citizens of different states and regions were all a part of the same unified country. I mentioned that when Madison came into office, unity among various parts of the United States and among the citizens was a big concern of his. But the war and the perceived victory a lot of Americans felt had occurred did a great deal to bind Americans together and give them pride in their heterogeneous, politically dispersed, and culturally distinct regions as one United States of America. Given Madison and others' deep concerns about national unity as he took office in 1809, the importance of this dynamic cannot be understated. And that is kind of the long and short of the War of 1812. Thanks, as always, for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it informative. If, again, you would like to help grow the show, I would be so very grateful for that. Please like and subscribe. Please spread the word. It's the best way to help me keep going doing this. I'm really enjoying it. I hope you are as well. And liking, subscribing, spreading the word, best thing you can possibly do to help out. So please do that. If you would like to reach out to me directly, if you have questions, comments, things you'd like me to touch on in the future, you can reach me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a text or leave me a voicemail at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks very much for watching again. Take care, and I will see y'all next time.